My daughter and her husband gave me 60 days to leave the house I owned. It was the most monumentally stupid mistake of their lives, because it gave me 59 days to methodically, legally, and completely dismantle theirs. They thought they were closing a chapter on my life. They had no idea they were handing me the pen to write their epilogue, and it was not going to be a happy one. It all started on a Tuesday, a day steeped in the gray melancholy of recent loss. I had just returned from the attorney's office, the stiff manila folder in my hands feeling heavier than a tombstone. My brother, David, had passed a month prior. We weren't just brothers. We were best friends, two pillars holding up the small roof of our family after my wife, Eleanor, had passed away 5 years earlier. His loss was an amputation of the soul. The meeting had been about his will. David, a lifelong bachelor and a shrewd real estate investor, had always been more successful than I let on to my family. He lived simply, but he had built a small empire. He had left me 2 apartments in the city, outright, no mortgage, no liens. One was a chic 1-bedroom in a newer building, the other a sprawling 2-bedroom pre-war with stunning views. I walked in my house, the house Eleanor and I had bought 40 years ago, the house where we raised our daughter, Chloe. And now, the house where Chloe and her husband, Mark, lived. For free. I found them in the living room, lounging on the sofa I'd paid for, watching a massive television I'd bought them last Christmas, the air conditioning I paid for humming softly. They looked up, their expressions bored. "Well," Chloe asked, not bothering to get up. "How'd it go? Did Uncle David leave you his dusty old stamp collection?" Mark snickered. I ignored the barb. I was still processing my grief, and the news from the attorney was a strange mix of sorrow and surprise. "It was productive," I said, setting the folder on the coffee table. "David was more financially secure than we knew. He left me 2 apartments in the city. The change in the room was electric. Boredom vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory glint in their eyes." They sat up straight. "2," Mark said, leaning forward. "Like 2 actual apartments?" "Yes," I said quietly. "A 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom." Chloe clapped her hands together, a gesture that was entirely devoid of joy and full of avarice. "Oh my God, Dad, that's perfect. We can finally get out of this dusty old place. We'll take the 2-bedroom, obviously. The views are probably amazing. We can sell my car and Mark's and just use the train. This is it, Mark. This is our big break." Still there. Not a word of sympathy for her late uncle. Not a question about how I was feeling. Not a single, solitary thought for anyone but themselves. It was as if I had just announced they had won the lottery, a lottery paid for by my brother's death. "Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "They're my apartments. David left them to me." She waved a dismissive hand. "Don't be difficult, Dad. What are you going to do with 2 apartments? Rattle around in one of them by yourself? You have this huge house. This huge house is my home," I said, the words feeling like a line drawn in the sand. "And the apartments are part of my retirement plan. They're an investment." "Income," Mark scoffed. "Income? You've got your pension. What more do you need? We're the ones just starting out. We're the ones who need a leg up. It's a matter of what's fair. The word hung in the air, thick and poisonous. I had paid for their college educations. I had paid the down payment for their cars. I paid their insurance. I paid for the food they ate, the water they drank, the electricity they used. They lived in my home, a home I owned outright, without contributing a single dollar to the mortgage, the taxes, or the upkeep. And he wanted to talk to me about what was fair. "No," I said. The word was small, but it was made of steel. "The apartments are mine." That is the end of the discussion. Chloe's face, so often a mask of pleasant indifference, twisted into something ugly. "You are so selfish. You're just like you were when Mom was alive, always thinking about yourself, hoarding everything. It's our turn now. We have lives to live, and you're holding us back, sitting here in this museum." The insult to her mother, to our life together, was a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. But I held my ground. "This is my house." Chloe. Mark stood up, puffing out his chest. He was a man whose confidence had been bought and paid for by me, and he was utterly blind to that fact. "Look, old man," he began, And the disrespect in those two words was the spark that lit the fuse. We've been more than patient. We've been living here, helping you out, keeping you company, helping me out. I almost laughed. You live here rent-free. I support you. In what way exactly have you been helping me? We're family, Chloe shrieked. This is what family does. No, Chloe, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. This is what you do. You take, and you take, and you take, and you have never once said thank you. That was it. That was the moment the dam broke. Fine, she spat, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury only the truly entitled can muster. Be that way. But we're done living under your thumb. This house is too big for you anyway. It's a family home, and we're the family now. We're staying. You can go live in one of your precious new apartments. We're giving you 60 days. 60 days to pack your things and get out. I looked from her face to Mark's. He was nodding, a smug, idiotic grin plastered on his face. They actually believed it. They believed they had the right, the power, to evict me from my own home. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up the manila folder from the table, turned, and walked to my study, closing the heavy oak door behind me. The click of the latch echoed the closing of a door in my heart. The part of me that saw Chloe as my little girl, the part that made excuses for her, the part that loved her unconditionally, went silent. In its place, something cold and methodical began to stir. The hurt was immense, a physical ache in my chest. But beneath it, a different feeling was taking root, resolve. They had given me 60 days, a generous timeline, in their minds. They thought my silence was acquiescence, the whimper of a defeated old man. They had no idea it was the quiet hum of a powerful engine warming up. I sat at the desk that had been my wife's, its surface worn smooth by her hands. I looked at the picture of us on the corner, smiling on a beach in Hawaii. Eleanor had always said my kindness was my greatest strength, but that I needed to be careful it wasn't mistaken for weakness. Well, Ellie, I whispered to the photograph, they made the mistake for the next hour. I did nothing but think. I replayed every entitled demand, every disrespectful word. I cataloged every expense, every handout, every time I'd swallowed my pride for the sake of a fragile piece. They saw me as a walking ATM, a utility they could exploit until it ran dry. They had no concept of the man I was before I retired. They thought I was a mid-level manager at a paper company, living off a modest pension and the equity in my house. That was the story I'd let them believe. It was simpler. The truth was far more complex. I wasn't a mid-level manager. I was the founder and silent majority owner of a highly successful software logistics company. I had stepped away from the day-to-day operations a decade ago, handing the reins to my younger partners, but I retained a 60% stake. The pension they thought I lived on was actually just the interest from a single, conservative investment account. My true net worth was something they couldn't even comprehend. Their ignorance, which I had cultivated to keep them from becoming even more spoiled, was now my greatest weapon. They were about to learn that actions have consequences. My first call was not to a friend or a therapist. It was to my attorney, the same man who had just read me my brother's will. Robert, I said, my voice steady, I have a new project for you. A domestic matter. I laid out the situation, the ultimatum they had given me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Frank, he said, his voice laced with disbelief. They're trying to evict you from a property you own outright, in which they have zero equity and no lease agreement. That is the short of it. Yes, they are, to use the legal term, tenants at will. You can have them removed with a standard 30-day notice to quit. You don't need to give them 60 days, I know, Robert, but we're going to be more strategic than that. I don't just want them out. I want them to understand. I spent the next hour on the phone with Robert, outlining my plan. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Frank, he said finally, I've handled some vindictive divorces in my time, but this is a masterclass in poetic justice. I'll get the paperwork started. My next call was to my financial advisor, a sharp young woman named Sarah. Sarah, it's Frank. I need to make some immediate changes to my portfolio of dependents. I had her pull up the accounts. The 2 auto leases in my name for Chloe's Trinity SUV and Mark's wannabe sports car. The two high-limit credit cards, I'd given them for emergencies that they use for brunch and designer clothes. The family cell phone plan. I want you to begin the process of terminating everything, I said. The credit cards, I want them canceled by the end of the week. Send me the final statements. The cars, contact the leasing company. I want to terminate the leases. Schedule the repossessions for, let's say, 30 days from today. And the cell phone plan, remove their lines from my account on that same day. Of course, Frank, she said, her voice betraying no surprise. She was a professional. What about the utilities at the house? Leave them for now, I said. They have a 60-day timeline. The power and water go off on day 61. The first 2 weeks were an exercise in supreme self-control. I was a ghost in my own home. I ate early before they woke up and retired to my study in the evenings. I was polite, but my replies were clipped and devoid of warmth. They, on the other hand, were insufferable. They were giddy with their newfound power. They walked around my house as if it were already theirs. I overheard them in the kitchen, Mark talking about knocking down the wall between the dining room and the living room. We'll open up the whole space, he said, his voice booming with unearned authority. Make it an open-concept living area. Your dad's taste is so dated, Chloe agreed. And we can turn his study into a nursery. It gets the best afternoon light and nursery. In my study, surrounded by my books and Eleanor's memory. The cold resolve in my chest hardened into something akin to Arctic ice. They were not just erasing me. They were erasing my entire life, my history, my love. They saw my silence as surrender. They saw my detachment as the grief of a defeated old man. They were fools. On day 15, the first domino fell. I was in the garden when I heard Chloe's car screech into the driveway. She slammed the door and stormed into the house. A moment later, she was standing in the doorway to the patio, her face flushed with anger. My card was declined, she said, her voice dangerously high. At Nordstrom, in front of everyone. How could you embarrass me like that? I calmly snipped a dead rose from its stem. I canceled the card, Chloe, you what? What? Those cards were for emergencies, I said, not looking at her. A $500 handbag is not an emergency. You have a job. Mark has a job. It's time you learn to live within your means. Our means, she shrieked. We can't survive on our means. You know that. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you decided to evict your primary benefactor, I said coolly, and went back to my roses. She stared at me, speechless for the first time in her life. The concept of her actions having direct, immediate consequences was utterly foreign to her. She stormed back into the house, and I heard her and Mark arguing in loud, panicked whispers. The first crack had appeared in their fantasy world. 10 days later, on day 25, the second shoe dropped. The certified letters from the auto leasing company arrived. I made sure to be the one to get the mail that day. I left the 2 envelopes on the hall table, addressed to Chloe and Mark respectively. I was in my study with the door slightly ajar when they found them. There was a moment of confused silence, then the sound of paper tearing, followed by Mark's enraged voice. What the hell is this? Lease termination? They're coming to take the cars. They stormed my study, no knocking, no respect. Mark threw the letter on my desk. What did you do? He demanded. I leaned back in my chair. You told me I needed to downsize my life. I'm simply downsizing my expenses. The leases for those 2 cars are a significant monthly expense. Since you'll be taking the train from your new apartment soon, I figured you wouldn't need them anymore. They're being picked up in 5 days, 5 days. Chloe wailed. How are we supposed to get to work? How are we supposed to do anything? Uber, I suppose, I said with a shrug. Or the bus. It builds character. The panic in their eyes was real now. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a dawning horror. Their world, built on a foundation of my money, was beginning to shake. They still didn't get it, though. They thought this was just me being difficult. They thought they still held the ultimate trump card, my house. They were wrong. On day 30, exactly halfway through their ridiculous 60-day ultimatum, the doorbell rang. It was just after 5 p.m. Chloe and Mark were on the back patio, sullenly drinking beer. I watched from the window as a man in a crisp, professional suit walked up the path. He wasn't a salesman. He was a process server. I'd paid for the best. He rang the bell, and when no one answered, He walked around to the back. "Are you Chloe and Mark?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. They nodded, confused. "This is for you," he said, handing them a large, official-looking envelope. He had them sign for it. Then he turned and walked away. I watched as they tore it open. I saw Chloe's face go white. I saw Mark read it over her shoulder, his jaw dropping. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a letter from their angry father. It was a formal, legally binding notice to quit. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that as tenants at will residing at this address, their tenancy was hereby terminated, and they had 30 days from the date of service to vacate the premises. Failure to do so would result in formal eviction proceedings. Their 60-day timeline was a work of fiction. My 30-day timeline was the law. The explosion was instantaneous. They ran into the house, into my study, their faces contorted with rage and fear. "What is this?" Chloe screamed, waving the paper in my face. "You can't do this." "On the contrary," I said, gesturing to the document. "As my lawyer, Robert, can confirm, I absolutely can. You're living in my house. You have no lease. I am terminating your tenancy. You have 30 days, but we gave you 60 days." Mark stammered, the absurdity of his own statement lost on him. "Your offer was noted and rejected," I said. "My terms are 30 days. The clock started today. I suggest you start packing." The next few weeks were a blur of their escalating desperation. The cars were repossessed on day 31, just as planned. A tow truck for Chloe's SUV and a flatbed for Mark's ridiculous car. They had to start taking the bus, an indignity that seemed to wound them more than anything else. They called a lawyer, who, after presumably charging them a hefty consultation fee they couldn't afford, told them the grim truth. They had no legal leg to stand on. They were guests who had overstayed their welcome, and I was well within my rights. Their anger slowly morphed into a pathetic, wheedling sort of pleading. The apologies started. They were hollow and self-serving. "Dad, we're so sorry. We weren't thinking. We made a mistake. We were just stressed." They tried to appeal to my love for Eleanor. "Mom would be so disappointed in you," Chloe cried one evening. "That was a mistake. A grave one. My wife," I said, my voice like a razor's edge, "will be appalled by your greed and disrespect. She would be ashamed that the daughter she raised would try to throw her own father out of his home. Do not ever speak her name in this context again." The final week arrived. The house was filled with a tense, miserable silence. They had sold some of Chloe's designer bags and Mark's expensive electronics to scrape together a deposit for a tiny, one-bedroom apartment in a run-down complex across town. The reality of their new life was setting in, and it was bleak. On the final day, the day before the movers they had to hire were set to arrive, they made one last desperate stand. They found me in the living room, surrounded by boxes of their belongings. They both looked haggard and defeated. "Dad, please," Chloe began, tears streaming down her face. This time, they looked real. "Don't do this. We'll do anything. We'll pay rent. We'll get second jobs. We'll be better." I let them finish. I listened to all their promises, all their pathetic bargaining. When they were done, I stood up and walked over to the bookshelf. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I opened it on the coffee table. "You think this is about money, don't you?" I said quietly. "You think I'm doing this to be cruel?" I laid out the first document. It was the deed to the house. "This house," I said, tapping the paper, "is in my name. It was paid off in full 12 years ago. The property taxes last year were $24,000. Could you afford that on your salaries?" They stared dumbfounded. Next, I pulled out a quarterly statement from my investment firm. I didn't show them the full amount, just the summary page. The number was large enough to make Mark physically recoil. "You think I live on a small pension?" I continued. "You thought I was some frail old man you could push around. You thought you were doing me a favor by keeping me company. You were blind to the fact that I have been single-handedly funding your entire adult lifestyle." Finally, I pulled out my laptop. I opened a web browser and navigated to a popular real estate site. I showed them the listings for the 2 apartments my brother had left me. They were beautifully staged, professionally photographed. "These are the apartments," I said. "The ones you felt so entitled to." I clicked on one of them. This one, the two-bedroom you wanted, has already been leased to a young doctor and his family. The rent is $6,000 a month. I clicked on the other. This one has also been leased to a young lawyer for $1,000 a month. That's $10,000 a month in income. Income that, had you shown an ounce of gratitude or respect, I might have shared with you. A fund for your future children, perhaps. A down payment on a home of your own. One day, I closed the laptop. I looked at their shattered faces. The full scope of their catastrophic miscalculation was finally dawning on them. It wasn't just about losing a free place to live. It was about the colossal, life-altering opportunity they had burned to the ground with their own arrogance. You gave me 60 days to leave my home, I said, my voice calm and clear. Instead, you have given yourself a life lesson. You wanted this house? You can't afford to maintain it. You wanted the apartments? You have lost them and any potential benefit from them forever. You wanted a life of luxury? You can barely afford the deposit on a dingy apartment. You have nothing because you were ungrateful for everything you were given. I walked to the front door and opened it. The movers will be here tomorrow. I expect you and all of your belongings to be gone by 5 p.m. Leave the keys on the counter. I didn't watch them go. The next day, I sat in my quiet, empty house. The silence was profound. It wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. It was the sound of order being restored. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, running my hand along the walls they had wanted to tear down. This was my house, my home, my sanctuary. They made the mistake of thinking my kindness was a weakness. They learned, in the hardest way possible, that a patient man, when pushed past his limit, has the longest memory and the firmest resolve. They had to start over from absolute zero, humbled and broken by their own entitlement. I, on the other hand, felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't triumph. It was justice. It was the quiet satisfaction of a debt being paid in full. They didn't just lose a house. They lost a father. And that was a price they would be paying for the rest of their lives. What would you have done in my position? Was I too harsh, or was this a lesson that had to be taught? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. Thank you for listening.